It was late autumn when Marissa first moved into the old house on Elm Street, a quaint two-story structure that looked almost too perfect against the backdrop of falling leaves and fog. The house had a history, one that locals would mention in hushed tones, but it was also cheap, and Marissa needed a fresh start. Her father had passed away the previous spring, and the quiet solitude of a small town seemed like the ideal place to heal. The first week was uneventful. Marissa spent her evenings unpacking, adjusting to the creaks of the house, but by the second week, something felt off. It started with faint knocks, soft enough that she thought it might be the wind or her imagination. They came at odd hours, usually late in the night, when she was just about to drift off to sleep. She tried to ignore them, but they grew louder over time. On the third week, Marissa woke up to the unmistakable sound of footsteps pacing across the hallway, across from her bedroom. Her heart raced, but she convinced herself it was just the house settling again, or perhaps a neighbor's dog, though the footsteps sounded far too deliberate for that. It wasn't until she met Mrs. Abernathy, the elderly woman who lived across the street. Things took a dark turn. Mrs. Abernathy was an odd figure, always peering through her windows as if the world was passing her by. When Marissa introduced herself, Mrs. Abernathy smiled softly, though there was a strange sadness in her eyes. "You're living in the old Hillstead house, aren't you?" Mrs. Abernathy asked, voice barely a whisper. Marissa nodded. "Yes, it's a lovely place. A bit older than I expected, but it feels like home." Mrs. Abernathy's smile faded. "It's a beautiful house, yes, but you should know. It has a history. Strange things have happened here for years. People say they can feel him." Marissa laughed nervously, unsure whether Mrs. Abernathy was just old and eccentric. Feel him? She pondered. The old woman's gaze turned serious. The man who built the house, he was different. He had a thing for watching people. They say he never left. Marissa brushed it off, thinking it was just one of those ghost stories the town loved to tell. But that night, as she lay in bed, the knocking resumed, louder than before. She felt it this time, a distinct pressure in the air, as if something or someone was right outside her door. Her breath caught in her throat as the footsteps started again, slow and heavy, moving down the hall. The next morning, she woke up to find the hallway light on, something she was certain she had turned off the night before. When she checked the front door, there were smudged fingerprints on the glass, as if someone had been pressing their hands against it from the outside. She was no longer sure if she was imagining things. A feeling of being watched lingered wherever she went in the house. And it wasn't just from the corner of her eyes. It was deeper, like a presence in the room, waiting for something. One evening, unable to sleep, Marissa decided to explore the attic. She had heard rumors that the previous owners had left behind old furniture and personal items, but she hadn't checked yet. When she climbed the stairs to the attic, she saw a dusty chest tucked into the corner. Curiosity pushed her to open it, and inside, she found a stack of old photographs. Sepia-toned images of the house through the years. One photograph caught her eye. It was a picture of the house from the early 1900s, taken in the exact spot where she now stood. In the window of the second story, there was a figure, pale, gaunt, and staring directly at the camera. It was the man Mrs. Abernathy had warned her about. Shivers ran down her spine as the realization hit. The man in the photo was no mere ghost. He was the presence she had been feeling all along. He hadn't just been watching the house, he had been watching her. Terrified, she turned to leave the attic. But just as she reached the stairs, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed behind her. She spun around, heart racing, but the attic was empty. The air was thick with an oppressive silence. It was then that she understood he had been waiting for her to see him, to acknowledge him, and now he would never leave. The footsteps followed her every night after that, always just behind her, always just out of sight. She could never shake the feeling that he was always there, watching her. And to this day, the house on Elm Street remains empty, its windows staring out at the world as the footsteps echo in the dark, waiting for the next person to move into the house on Elm Street.